Throughout this week, despair has been my private pain, because with brainstorming with the Sunday Services Committee a couple of months ago, we came up with this topic of the radical middle, the place of moderation in life. And I thought that's a wonderful topic, but as I got closer and closer to it, I wasn't feeling very moderate. And especially in this last few weeks, there's the shark in me has seen some blood in the water, and I've gotten excited that way. And then there's just the things just seem to keep on going inexorably to some really sad places with the war, and then issue to issue every day the headlines back and forth, and there's just such a polarized society today, and it seems that all the time everyone has these extreme views, and people stake their claim for absolute truth and then they scream it across the chasm, and the people in the middle are made to choose one side or the other, or be pushed into the chasm. Any attempt to span the chasm is greeted with suspicion by true believers on both sides. The radical middle, those people who stand in the gap, consists of at least two types. First, the internal moderate, those who have a mixture of liberal and conservative views, such as gay Republicans or anti-abortion Democrats. And then the second group is the external moderate, who sees all this strife and says, these people say this and these people say that, and they say, is there some way that we can compromise? Is there some way that we can get, can we all just get along? And so I'm talking about polarization in our society, and I'm going to talk about the 5 poles, or identify 5 poles of liberalism and conservatism. I think on one hand, I guess it's the left hand, liberalism has 5 basic poles: nonviolence, sexual freedom, environmental protection, and sharing of wealth, and equality among humans. And in my mind, on the right hand, that conservatism has 5 basic orders: violence to enforce order, sexual rules, environmental use, free markets, and hierarchies among humans. And of course, since I'm unabashed liberals coming up with these categories, it probably, the words I use for the conservative ones are I'm sure there are better words for that. And I know there are, because I know that, security are words that are used to, using war and defense, and morality for sexual rules. And so anytime you enter into one of these things, the language that you use and the things that you say reveal your biases, so I might as well just be up front with them, as if anybody didn't know. Very few people are pure types. Most of us fall in some continuum between nonviolent and violent. Even a pacifist like me enjoys football. And sexually, most of us lie somewhere between libertines and prudes. There are straight couples who are swingers and gay couples who are monogamous. I don't know where that falls on the continuum between liberal and conservative. Also, being liberal in one category does not mean that you are liberal in another category or being conservative in another category. A log cabin Republican may be sexually liberal but fiscally conservative. A member of Ducks Unlimited may be pro-gun because they like to hunt ducks. And so they like that killing. But for environmental protection so that they will have wetlands on which to hunt. And so a member of Ducks Unlimited can't vote for the Democrat who wants gun control or for the Republican who wants to drain the swamp to build condos. A black stockbroker may want government enforcement of laws that protect equal opportunity, but does want the government to stop taxing his capital gains. The first type of moderate, that internal moderate, bounces between those categories as sexually conservative, pro-violence, anti-racist, pro-environment, yet seeking individual wealth. All of us have these combinations within us. There could be many mixtures. And these people have to judge each candidate on a variety of issues, voting for the candidate that is closest to their views. And of course, liberals like myself have to do this too. I mean, every presidential candidate I have voted for has been for the death penalty. I am against the death penalty. But I have to look at a candidate and say, this one's closest to who I am. But the moderates have a harder time. I think they're always bouncing between the poles. Now, the second type of moderate, the external moderate, is the one that tries to seek the middle ground. We'll see the debate that's out there and says, there's got to be some middle ground between these two issues. And this is a difficult place to be because the middle is always shifting. If one side is always compromising, then the middle shifts. For example, torture by the U.S. government was illegal. And then someone in the government invented a category of prisoner that wasn't protected by the Geneva Convention. Now, prisoners have died in our custody and no one's held accountable. Senator McCain, a Republican, puts an amendment in the defense bill saying that U.S. will not torture. Vice President Cheney, a Republican, agrees with that, except he asks for one exception, the CIA. I mean, and you think, how can there be a middle position on torture? And you listen to the radio and you hear all these gradients of, well, if you're standing in a room without food and never being allowed to sit for 24 hours, that is physical stress but not torture. But once a bamboo shoot is put under the fingernail, then it becomes torture. And I thought, I never knew there were so many gradients of what torture is and where it is the middle ground on torture. Because I've heard some people say that Abu Ghraib was just like fraternity hazing. Well, that means we probably should stop fraternity hazing. Things have also shifted in the other directions. Things like sexual freedom. Adultery used to be a crime punishable by law, and divorce was illegal. And so then a compromise was struck, and so the injured party could then sue for divorce in court, in a civil court. And then people thought, well, that was getting everybody's business into the public record, and that was kind of nasty. And so another compromise was made. Now there's no-fault divorce, and no charges of adultery are brought forward. I mean, if we follow along this continuum, adultery might become the expected norm in marriage. That's that thin edge of the wedge argument where people say, if I compromise on one thing, the whole thing is going to unravel. Minimum wage has not gone up in 8 years. Now, so what might have been a fair compromise years ago probably is not adequate today. And in fact, the government is planning to allow Katrina contractors to hire people below minimum wage to encourage them to come in and work at Katrina. And so I'm trying to figure out how going backwards on something like minimum wage is a compromise. I mean, with CEOs earning higher and higher wages, maybe it's time to consider a maximum wage. What if the boss could only earn 100 times what the lowest employee earned? The janitor gets $10,000 a year, the boss gets $1 million. That seems like it would be fair. But the reality is that the boss is getting $50 million, and the janitor is getting less. So I bring these things up because things evolve over time. That the which seems like a good place in the middle at one point in your life suddenly can become far left or far right, or just sometimes outdated. In abortion, that decision is over 30 years old, and it allowed for abortion, but it allowed for the possibility of regulation as the fetus gets more and more viable. Well, in the past 30 years, medical technology has advanced such that fetuses are viable at younger and younger times. Does that change the nature of the debate? When a fetus can live outside the womb much earlier than they could before. But then on the other side, medicines or pills, women don't have to go to a surgeon to have an abortion. A pill that can do it safely before it even gets to anywhere out of the first trimester. And so you have the technology has changed, and the debate's so polarized that people can't figure out how to hold on to protect women. See, this middle ground, it's a hard place to be because it shifts. I remember when Howard Dean signed the same-sex civil union bill, he was as far left as you could go at the moment in the United States. And then in the middle of his presidential campaign, Massachusetts passed a Gay Marriage Act. And so then he was backpedaling and saying he was for civil unions but not gay marriage. And all of a sudden, instead of being a leftist, he was trying to be a moderate. And of course, anybody running for president tries to elevate their moderate things because you have to kind of run towards the middle. And Governor Dean was pretty much a conservative on gun rights. And so he said he wanted to appeal to Southerners who had rifle racks in their pickup trucks. And then he continued that sentence by saying, and the Confederate flag. Which then in my mind said, oh, is he going for the pro-slavery vote? That's a lot farther right than I want to be. But then he screamed, and it no longer mattered whether he was right, left, or center. Colin Powell was a Republican war hero, and he flirted with running for president. But he also believed in affirmative action, and he was more moderate than the Christian right of his party, and his campaign never got off the ground. He was considered the voice of caution as this administration prepared for war, and as such, he didn't make the second term. The middle is a precarious place to be, because if you are sitting on the fence, someone will come and try to knock you off. It can be a balancing act. Are we nonviolent or forceful? Sexually liberated or sexually modest? Living in the wilderness or using the earth's resources? Taking a vow of poverty or living it up? In what ways do we consider ourselves equal to others? What ways are we worse? And what ways do we consider ourselves better? This balance of where we are on these continuums goes on in all of us. Now, liberals will say the balance is between freedom and fascism. Now, conservatism would say the balance is between chaos and order. Now, see, liberals like myself have to learn that not all order is fascism. Although, getting out of bed in the morning, I do curse gravity. It's always oppressing me and keeping me down. And conservatives need to learn that not all freedom is chaos. I mean, sex doesn't always have to have a high purpose, such as sanctifying marriage or producing children. Sometimes it's okay just to have fun. Conservatives would say that God created order out of chaos, and liberals would say that evolution created order out of chaos. So there's both a kind of recognition of order between religious and religious liberals and religious conservatives. But evolution is a bit more frightening because it's chaotic and it's continuing and it's still going to happen over and over, and it might evolve into creatures that are superior to human beings that will take over the world and all that. When you start thinking of a world that is constantly changing, it's frightening to some, and they want to have an intelligent designer who's at least controlling and reining in the process. Conservatives say that some people only respond to force. In the torture debate, is like, well, what if you have a guy and you know he knows where the bomb is? Should you not torture him just because you only have 30 minutes to go? That's the scenario that comes up over and over because that person will only respond to force. Now, liberals will say that the force of love is the strongest force of all, that torture is counterproductive into getting good intelligence because people will say anything just to stop the torture, whether it's real or not. And there are times when military might fails, and conservatives will say that this is the exception to the rule, that if we had just put in more resources, we could have won Vietnam. And liberals will say this proves violence is wrong. But then liberals have to contend with stopping Hitler and the Holocaust. Well, gee, maybe that might have been a good use of violence. So we're always kind of pulling that balance out. And then there's times when diplomacy succeeds, but we never notice that when talking and compromise works, because you don't ever name the peace. I mean, you name the wars, the Revolutionary, the War of 1812, the Mexican War. But what were the names of the pieces that were between these great wars in American history? I'd like to see a history book written saying, well, the peace of the turn of the century, and they'd have a name for it, We find ourselves always going between these polarities, bouncing between peace and war, sex and celibacy, equality versus victory, religion and charity versus greed. I mean, there's just all these things that keep tugging us, and we all kind of like to say, well, we're reasonable, we might be in the middle, or if we aren't in a reasonable mood, we're saying, well, we're where the middle should be if everybody would just agree with me. Moderates are caught in this tug of war, seeking balance within themselves and in society. But there's a third way to be moderate, and that's to be part of the radical middle. The radical middle who somehow transcends the struggle. It realizes that every action I take is likely to have an equal reaction on the other side. And they're not surprised by opposition. They realize that, as in the Taoist symbol of yin and yang, the black contains the white and the white contains the black. Your opposite is not necessarily your enemy. It's a part of you that you do not understand. I may suppress my violent side, but I cannot deny that I do have a violent side. And I cannot deny that I have entertained thoughts of violent acts on people who I disagree with politically. Going, what would happen if? But, so it's a struggle. I can't say that that person's different from me, that that person is wholly somebody that needs to be annihilated. There's no sense of redemption, in destroying your enemy. There's an old poem that goes, "They drew a circle to shut me out, but I had the strength to win. I drew a circle that brought them in." When we refuse to fall into the trap of polarities, new solutions arise. The bipartisan group in the Senate agreed to defend the rules of the Senate, however arcane, rather than get pulled into the radical debate over judges. The jury is still out whether this is a mere compromise or a beginning of a new civility and cooperation. Another, possibly better example may be like the Nature Conservancy. They take what is a conservative value and then they use it for conservation. I mean, it's a conservative value that this is my property. I should be able to do what I want with it. And so there's a resistance to government regulations and that type of thing. Well, the Nature Conservancy takes that at face value and says, okay, now we're going to pool our money and buy property and choose to leave it as wilderness. It's taking a conservative value and turning it on its head for conservation. In private business, I've read articles about Costco, who somehow has developed a business model that allows it to be profitable and growing while also paying its employees better than its competitors. I don't know, maybe management and labor can work together for mutual benefits. Recent brain research shows that women's brains and men's brains tend to operate differently. And so we have this equality that we no longer have to force people to be the same. Because we always just say, well, guys, anything I can do, you can do better, the whole song. And you just kind of have the sense that women and men have to be exactly the same. But equality doesn't have to mean that. It means that differences can be celebrated and honored, and you can value them both equally. It's harder for me when I'm trying to think of the middle way between violence and non-violence. But then I got to thinking that I've read some articles about non-lethal weaponry, crowd control. Well, there's the tasers, and then there's things like microwave things that do heat that people move out of the way, and they're scary things because I'm like, well, do we really want to put all this research into weaponry? Because weaponry itself just kind of makes my back crawl. But if it's weaponry that's used instead of more lethal weaponry, but does some of that control stuff, is that a benefit or is that a harm? Is there a way to control the people who do only seem to understand violence, that I'm going to do whatever I want to? The person robbing the liquor store and pointing the gun at people might need someone to stop them with physical force. Is there ways to do that in a non-lethal way? Is there ways that we can improve that? Those are struggles that a moderate has to try to figure out. Oh, I can't just stay in my ideological purity, because there are real situations that are difficult and that my pat answers don't always answer. A radical middle that's not satisfied with what the world defines as left and right, because that changes. Just look at deficit spending. It seems to have moved from one party to the other. And I don't know how that happened. Compromise is where both sides lose a little. And that's the mediocre middle. The radical middle searches for win-win solutions. How do we stop terrorists? How do we make them no longer feel the need for terrorism? There's got to be a way when both sides are saying, my way or the highway, for the radical middle to find a new way, a way that affirms everyone. These are my thoughts. I invite yours.
Seems to me that one of the ways to achieve radical middlehood is to practice something that a number of different communicators have put in different language. Stephen Covey said it as seek first to understand. But the whole idea where we put ourselves in trying to inquire or understand another's position prior to advocating for our own.
I mean, to listen, so not just so I can come up with my rebuttal.
Right. Not to hold still and be quiet while the other person is talking, but to actively understand it and then to advocate for one's own position.
Wow.
Two comments. And first of all, I want to say I'm glad I am on here this morning, not because I had something to say, but because I heard what you said, and I think you said it excellently well and have provoked deep disturbances in my framework as to how to achieve something that you're calling the radical middle. Two thoughts. One is that part of the divisiveness that we have been living with since at least the Newt Gingrich days and perhaps before there was that there is, as I understand it, a deliberate intention to keep it divisive because it politically pays. And that gives rise to a deep puzzle. One possible thing that might be recruited toward the radical middle might be the recognition that there is a long element of the historical conservative tradition which is terribly at odds with what is called conservatism today. George Will has gotten used to simply referring to faux conservatives, like faux carpet floors or whatever. And one feature of this I'll just mention is that if you go from Edmund Burke to the present day, and you will see a succession of philosophers who, and I'm regarding Burke as one of those philosophers, who were absolutely opposed to anything that smacks of ideology. And as late as 20th century Michael Oakeshott, he is in effect defining conservatism as a view which cannot be expressed in an ideology, and that wipes out most of what we're calling conservatism today.
I'm staunchly a radical middle, and one of the things that radical middles do is that we tend to not like sound bites, we don't like labels, we don't like assumptions and generalizations, and we also tend to challenge hypocrisy. And so I'm going to challenge you right now, Charlie.
This is why we have this. This is why I love what you do.
On behalf of people who label themselves conservatives, either old conservatives or new, You mentioned that going into conservatism as being pro-slavery would be something I would challenge you on behalf of conservatives from the radical middle.
Because it was the Republican Party. That we could,
Compromise often gets a bad rap because it looks like surrender, which obviously to some degree it is. But it seems to me important to recognize that if you believe in democracy, you have to believe in compromise. And if you get 200 million people, you're not going to have two positions, one of which is a majority, one a minority. In fact, you're going to get a vast spectrum of positions. And the only way you can come up with a democratic outcome is if there's some sort of compromise among that vast spectrum of positions.
and I think one of the things with the Constitution is that balance between majority rule and minority rights, which is always difficult and fraught with
On
compromise.
the conservative side, I'm just seeking to understand how you're going to do some compromising.
It seems to me that part of the move toward more radical views on both the left and the right have to do with the increasing amount of money that's spent running for political office. And those on both the left and the right seek to raise this money from the most radical elements on either side.
Yeah, and so it's probably no accident that while the politics get more and more divisive, fewer people are participating in the actual voting.
I think an iconic president can be chosen for just about every political position. And the presidential icon for the moderate position, I think, is Abraham Lincoln. And it comes out in his second inaugural address when he says, and to care for him who has borne the battle and his widow and his orphan. And of course, he was talking about both sides. So, and then there are other things in Lincoln, such as his belief that if a contest is won, that you shouldn't take undue advantage of the loser. And that, I think, sums up the moderate position.
I'm glad we sparked lots of conversation, but let us continue. That conversation in our coffee hour and in our relations with each other, and join in singing hymn number 136, When Gentle Tides Go Rolling By.